It's the 32nd Sunday of Ordinary Time. Next week, the 33rd, is the last Sunday in Ordinary Time. And after that, the Sunday after that is Thanksgiving weekend, is the Solemnity of Christ the King, which brings us to the end of the liturgical year. So the readings this week, and those of the next couple of weeks, I'm warning you, are geared towards the end times. The other night, a commentator on the news said that the end times are upon us because all the signs are there. Hurricanes and earthquakes, mass shootings, and ISIS, he pointed out, which is an apocalyptic cult, is waging a war to bring on the end of the world. And he was worried that these and others who do not put their faith in Jesus Christ, as he said, were poised to take over. So he was sure these were signs of the end times. Those end times were very much the same question on people's minds in the first century. So this has been going on for a while. In Thessalonica, in 50 AD, they were thinking about this, but for very different reasons. Timothy had just returned from a visit to Macedonia, and he went to Corinth to join Paul, where he had shared the news about the various questions the Thessalonians had. They were wondering about the second coming, because many of them thought it was imminent. They thought they were going to be taken up to heaven while they were still alive. And they were wondering, and rightly so, what would happen to the community members who had already died. And so Paul wrote a letter to the community to give them some clarification. And as an aside, the first letter to the Thessalonians is the earliest written book of the New Testament. It was written about AD 50, so what scholars think. And if that's true, then it had only been less than 20 years since Jesus died that Paul is writing this letter. So many in the community thought the second coming was right around the corner. I'm not sure that Paul himself had fully developed his own eschatology, his own thoughts about and beliefs about the end times, because the issue had not really come up before. And now the first generation of community members were passing away. So what now? So Paul addresses their concerns. He says, "We do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, about those who have fallen asleep, so that you may not grieve like the rest who have no hope." The whole argument hinges on the last word, hope. It will come up over and over again in Paul's subsequent letters. Remember that Paul was preaching good news. And the good news is news about hope. It's news about salvation. And that happens because of Paul's firm belief that Jesus rose from the dead. So he goes on to remind the Thessalonians, if we believe that Jesus died and rose, and that's the central point of the argument, the crux of the issue, if you will, if we believe that Jesus died and rose, so too will God, through Jesus, bring with him those who have fallen asleep. Put another way, as God raised Jesus from the dead, so will he bring with Jesus those who have died with him. Paul was insistent that those who had died did not believe in vain. And he had to assure the Thessalonians that this was not necessarily just about the short term, as some had come to believe, but that their hope was going to be realized, whether Jesus came back now or tomorrow or some other time in the distant future. Because that's when the second coming happened. When the second coming happened was less important than the fact that it was going to happen. And that was a bit of a hard sell, because many of the people thought that if they believed in what Paul had preached, if they believed in what Paul was preaching now, that they were going to be saved now. Immediate gratification. It's not just a 21st century phenomenon. And therefore, don't worry about those believers who have died, Paul insists. Indeed, he says, we tell you this. On the word of the Lord, we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord will surely not precede those who have fallen asleep. In other words, God will keep His promises. Whether it happens now or it happens later, the promise will be kept because God is faithful. And therefore, we who believe, precisely because God is faithful, we who believe always have hope. That's Paul's basic argument. But that doesn't mean that we can be smug or self-assured, because just like the virgins in today's gospel, we have to be ready. Now, this is a bit of a strange parable. It never mentions the bride. It focuses on those who are going to meet the groom. And the groom is late for his own wedding feast. I don't think he's going to live much longer than that, if he's that late. But he's long delayed, the parable says. I wonder what he's doing. He arrives after midnight. So on the surface, it's a strange story. So I'm not going to go there. But we notice that when the 10 women originally arrived at the place where they were to wait, 5 foolish ones noticed that the wise women had brought extra oil with them. But humility doesn't seem to have been one of their virtues. Because when they saw the wise women had brought extra oil, the foolish women apparently just felt they knew better than the wise. The oil in their lamps would not run out. And when the foolish women discovered that they were wrong and that they were short on oil, they didn't lament their mistake. Their first thought was just to tell the others, hey, give me some of that oil. So the foolish women don't care if the wise suffer any consequences either. So I think these foolish women were willing to risk the welfare of the wise, provided only that the foolish had a chance of getting something for themselves. Apparently, love of others isn't one of the virtues of the foolish either. I think their folly lies in their insistence on having just what they want when they want it, no matter the risk or cost to anybody else. So these parables that we're going to be hearing and that we've heard, the parables about the parousia, about the end times, have nothing really to say about calculating the end. But they have much to say about living in readiness. And that's what Paul was trying to convey to the Christian community in Thessalonica. Don't be obsessed with when the end is going to come, because you are called to live in the present. We are called to live in readiness. We are called to live with a full flask of oil, so to speak. A full flask of charity, a full flask of kindness, a full flask of mercy, a full flask of justice. To live as Jesus lived. And so to be ready for when He does come back.